Доброго дня, радий всіх вітати на заході групи з аналізу гібридних загроз Українського кризового медіа-центру. Сьогодні наша тема стосується політики і історії в Росії, зокрема викривлена освіта, як Росія переписує історію. І поговоримо, зокрема, про новий підручник історії для 11 класів, в якому містяться значні пропагандистські сентенції про Україну. І, власне, з цього підручника учні
And the students will start working.
Володимир Солов'ян, старший аналітик груп аналізу гібридних загроз, також зі мною сьогодні.
Today with us we can see to our colleagues Matt Wickham, the analytician from the New Geopolitics Research Network, and also Alina, the PhD in history, the expert of the Ukrainian Center of Security and Cooperation. Ukraine is typically blamed for being very politicized, but in the framework of the authoritarian of the current situation, being neighbor of the authoritarian regimes, history is one of the piles of the political regime and also mobilization of the society for the aggression. And therefore, for us, it is very important to understand the key tendencies and the directions how the history is developing in the Russian Federation. So we shall start with a short presentation where I will tell you more about the new textbook on history in the Russian Federation, and I will try to provide you with a wider context of the development of history as a science in the Russian Federation. So first of all, we can differentiate four main topics which are covered by the history textbook in the Russian Federation from 6th to 11th grade, but nevertheless, we will first be interested in the history of the 21st century, the relations of Ukraine and the Russian Federation, and how the propaganda narratives are getting into the textbooks of the Russian Federation, and how they are trying to form the loyal co-citizens for themselves with the we can say the integrated model of the understanding of Ukraine. So till 2023, we had the Russian Federation had a few versions of the textbook for the schools. And why this one is new? Because they updated the program, and from the 7th, as of the 7th of August 2023, they presented a new book written by Tankonova and Medinsky. Before that, we had a separate textbook for these fields, but nowadays we can see that they are combining a few textbooks in one, and therefore we can say that teaching history in schools is going to be controlled by the Kremlin. And the main tendency is politicization of education, politicization of teaching the history, and the appearance of the propaganda narratives in the history school program. We can say a few more words about Medinsky himself. Since 2022, he is the deputy of the advisor of president, but he used to be, since 2012, he used to be the Minister of Culture, quite an odious person, and his cadency was related with lots of conflicts. And by the way, he was born in Cherkasy in Ukraine, and he was considered to be one of the most radical and ultra-conservative representatives of the Kremlin. And just for your general understanding of the context of the history of the context of the textbook on history of Ukraine, I have I decided to show you a few paragraphs from this new book, from this new textbook, and you can see that all of them, they were kind of copied. All of them, they duplicate the speeches of Putin. And when you're reading this textbook, it seems to be written by the authors of the speeches of the President of the Russian Federation. And most of these topics are becoming the basis for the pseudo-historical, quasi-historical speeches of the Vladimir Putin. And there is a separate topic. Russia is a country of heroes, and it shows some certain change in the narrative of the coverage of the war in Ukraine. And that is actually the main new thing, why the international media reacted that much in this case, because the Kremlin tried to explain the children his main objective, the reason why he started the war in Ukraine. And this subtopic dedicated to the heroes means that they are trying to make the heroes out of the deceased soldiers in Ukraine. And in this way, they are trying to make them heroes and to make children think less of the problems of the general reason of the war, and just to change the focus and shift the focus to some separate episodes of the war which are not related to the general framework of the reasons. And the main objective of the war. So they are trying to focus their attention on some aspects of the war, and the Russian ideologists, they are trying to recruit the new people to the army, to the Russian army, by trying to make heroes, to create heroes out of the soldiers who participated in the war in Ukraine. And of course, this textbook is not only ideological, but it is also Ukrainian phobic. And on this slide, you can see the main narratives which contain lots of anti-Ukrainian narratives, and it's very typical. They are talking about UNUPA, and it is commonly used in the Russian propaganda. But nevertheless, in the textbooks, in the school books on history, the authors were trying to avoid these kind of topics. Also, the authors are using manipulative questions. So, for example, the question in the end of the paragraph is aimed to make the student explain what he read in the paragraph, but the questions themselves are very manipulative because they make the student answer in some certain way. And sometimes the students, even having the different vision of these events, of these history, nevertheless, the student is not able to answer in the other way, because the way the question is formulated means that you can answer only in the way the Russian propaganda wants you to answer. And also, we can see the references which are mentioned in the book, and you can see that there are QR codes next to the references, and therefore it is much easier for the students to get access to these propaganda books. And in this way, they are trying to meet the needs and the peculiarities of interaction with information of the new generation. But of course, if we're talking about our topic broader, then we can say that the new book is just the first stage in the policy of the reconsideration of the humanitarian sciences in the Russian Federation and concentration on the historical topics and reconsideration of the role of the Russian Federation as a country in civilization. And therefore, there is a kind of illusion with scientific communism, and that is why we call this slide in this way, because comparing the scientific communism, which was spread in 1970s in the historical circles, we can see that there are some certain parallels with nowadays Putinism, because the way how they implement the new courses on history and the new courses in the university, the ones which are called the basis of the Russian state policy, is the way how they try to have an impact on the history, because the main objective of the subject of this course, which will be taught in the Russian university, this course will be taught on the technical specialties, and in this way they are trying to implement the best practices of the Soviet Union when they lost the control over the scientists, and they consider that to be a degradation of the capacity of the state to be competitive in different spheres, and that's at most important for them at the moment, taking into account that they would like to continue the war in Ukraine and they would like to get more scientists. And of course, we can also mention that the Kremlin takes into account the migration of the specialists during the first waves of mobilization, and one of the conclusions is that they are trying to relaunch the humanitarian sciences, and they are creating the ideological pressure on the scientists, and they are trying to change the mind of the IT specialists, of the techno specialists, and because they need them to develop the science in the Russian Federation. And therefore, the next stage of the development of these new narratives, which we can find in this book, that is the basics of the Russian Federation, which is going to be taught nevertheless what specialty you choose, also for the technical specialties. The main tasks of this course is the representation of the Russian Federation as the country of civilization, and that might be considered to be the shift in paradigm in the history in the Russian Federation, because for them it is very beneficial to show the Russian Federation as a country which represents a civilization, because that justifies what they are doing in Ukraine. And also the main difference is that the subject of the international law are the states, but not the civilization, and emphasizing that the Russian Federation is the civilization and not the state, and that they evolved into civilization. In this way, the Putin's ideologies, they are going to justify for the Russians, for their citizens, the loss which the Russians had due to the sanctions and the other difficulties which they faced after the beginning of the war. So the main objective of this course is showing the difference between the Russian Federation and the Western countries, and showing the contrast between the Russian Federation and civilization and the Western countries. And the Russian Federation And the authors of this course, according to the authors of this course, they are the country which represents civilization. Also, we have to mention the key elements of this course. That is attempted to introduce the key peculiarities of the Russians, so which is and that is the main emphasis during this course. And here you can find some parallels with the ethnopsychology, which was developing in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, but till the mid 20th century in the Western and scientific circles, it was considered to be very unjustified, because from the point of view of modern science, so we cannot say that the person's individual characteristics can be the same as every representative of his or her nation. And the main objective is that the categorization, which does not allow to explain the modern processes which exist in our info sphere. And we can say in this way that this course is quasi-scientific, because it combines the elements of the dead sciences, which had an impact on the development of the ideology in the 20th century, and which were used by Hitler, and in eugenics, which was quite popular in the capitalistic countries in the middle of the 20th centuries. But nowadays, these narratives are considered to be absolutely anachronic. But nevertheless, Kremlin is trying to use them to build the new course on the Russian history. And we can see that the authors are using the references to the works of those who are they are making the references to Thompson, Huntington, and the others, but also some ethnical studies. But also we can say that on the academical level, on the level of the heads of the universities, we have the project which is called the Russian DNA, and in this way we can see that they are trying to use scientific terminology for the justification of the new course, of the new ideological approach. But this approach shows that there is no justification for this course, because the main objective to use when we use these words like pentarchia, which are used by the authors of the book, or for example the name the Russian DNA, the main objective of these names is just to draw the attention of the young people, the people with a technical background, and to get them more involved into the humanitarian sciences. And a few words about this project. The project DNA of the Russian Federation is based on the basis of the staff of the humanitarian faculties of the Russian Federation, and they involve in the studies and cathedrals to complete the ideology of the Russian Federation. But of course, there is no ideological background for these studies, and we can describe them as the projects which are trying to get more financing from the Russian Federation, but also they are trying to create the visibility of the enhanced ideological development, but there is a general tendency. The general tendency which was described, the involvement of the humanitarians, science specialists to cooperate, to coordinate with technical specialties, to create something for the technical spheres, and to continue the aggressive war in Ukraine. And the last thing I would like to mention, that is one of the authors of and the creator of the project DNA of the Russian Federation, Andrei Polosin. He is a polittechnologist, the member of the party of Kiriyenko, a very famous technocrat of Kremlin technocrat. And what we could also mention in this part, for some comparison of the creators of the new historical approaches in education in the secondary school and high school, we can say that Medinsky is a fan who truly believes in the narratives he is creating and he's mentioning in his textbooks. But, for example, Andrei Polosin, he's just a technocrat, and I wouldn't say he believes in this project, that this ideology is justified, but nevertheless, they are the ones who are implementing these policies in the cultural and scientific spheres in the Russian Federation, and that is also a threat, because this technological approach can work out and it can be quite effective even in the conditions when the basis of these subjects, both in the universities and schools, and we can say that the approaches are quasi-scientific, but these kind of people can adaptate these narratives, some scientific studies which were done in the 19th century, and from our point of view they are outdated, but nevertheless they can use them and use them effectively by the modern technocrats in the Russian Federation. And that is what, in my opinion, we have to be afraid of, and we have to take it in account when we are trying to counter-propagate something, and when we are trying to organize some risks. So with this, I would like to stop presenting my part, and I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, Matt Wickham. And I know that you were also working on this new textbook. And could you tell me more? Could you tell us more? What is your impression, and what kind of narratives you can show?
Has said I've got more of a general overlook of the textbook so far. To know that the textbook obviously is an incredibly important subject for us to dive further into. So we are in the process of doing a deeper analysis of it at the moment. What I want to start off with is a little quote from George Orwell as well, 1984. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their understanding of history. Why is it an important quote, and why is Russian propaganda often related to and compared to George Orwell's 1984 novel? Well, firstly, obviously, you've got state-controlled media, you've got manipulation of language to distort meanings and downplay events, and alterations of historical records to fit changing narratives and to serve the government's agenda. This coincides exactly with what this new textbook is about. We see this over and over throughout the whole textbook, especially towards the end when they start talking about the so-called special military operation and the events just before. So who are the authors? So Volodymyr gave a little introduction of Volodymyr Medinsky, an influential figure in Russia and also known for his provocative comments and distortion of history in the past. In 2016, he told how the Russian people had a extra chromosome. So you can understand what kind of person we're dealing with when we're trying to analyze this textbook. And obviously one of the best individuals, candidates for choosing a distortion of history. In a recent interview, Medinsky was speaking about the how people related to the textbook so far. Many, even liberals, have said that it's a good textbook up until the point where we start talking about Putin, up until Putin's reign, where they say that we need to basically set a light of this part of the book. He said that kind of comment is one of the best comments that any author of any book, of historical textbooks, can receive, which is extremely interesting. In contrast to the past textbooks, so in contrast to the Stalin's era of 1952 textbook and we've got in 1980 Brezhnev's era, it becomes evident that those textbooks were a lot less politicized than this textbook today, that we're the subject of matter. And that points towards an intensified effort at desperate measures from the Russian government and Russian propagandists, and a failing instrument of propaganda which worked so well in the past. Interestingly, the Russian propagandists are also calling on parents of the school children to read the textbook as well, with the textbook being discounted by 20% to usual rates, which they go for, obviously, therefore, being able to cover a wider audience. And considering the textbook is for the grade 11, so I'm assuming around the 16-year-old pupils, it means that their parents would be presumably part of the generation of the Soviet Union and still has these Soviet Union education, and they are rather susceptible targets for Russian propaganda. Russian propagandist Armin Gasparin points out that the significance of the textbook is that what is taught at schools is one of the most important times where the children and their mind and ability to critical think is formulating. And so they understand the importance of controlling the narrative and indoctrinating these children at such a young age. From our analysis, Volodymyr has commented a few of the chapters in the book. I would just point out a few things which were noticeable straight away. So if we were to look at the cover of the book, you can see straight away the Kerch Bridge, pride and joy of Putin, and strangely enough, a missile in the middle, which can only be kind of depicted as a kinjali. Very strange to be so proud of something so deadly. Chapters that stood out so far in our analysis was US pressure on Russia, countering Western strategy, falsification of history by the West, returning of Crimea, so annexation, Minsk agreements, and the so-called special military operation. The irony is striking, though. Within a book designed to solely distort history, there's a chapter titled Falsification of History of the West. These chapters serve to demonize the West and promote a narrative that aligns with the Russian government's agenda. Furthermore, the focus on the external elements in the book reflects the Kremlin's underlying vulnerability, as I said at the beginning. The core justification for its existence, this textbook's existence, appears to be rooted in the confrontation with the West. Instead of highlighting Russia's, if you can highlight Russia's historical achievements, the narrative concentrates on portraying Russia's success in resisting a perceived collective West enemy. This emphasis is aiming to evoke emotions of pride and nationalism, a sentiment very strong among all the Russians. This is done in order to fabricate and glorify the past achievements while downplaying its flaws, such as failing to mention its failure to take Kiev, its withdrawal from Kharkiv, its withdrawal from Kherson. The textbook fails to mention these moments. In regards of manipulation, the textbook is also used for, obviously, political propaganda and creates a sense of sense of stability and justification for the Russian people, following what can only be described as a failure. The part of the textbook where they start talking about the special military operation, the main component of this upgraded textbook, is rather quite short, and it just provides 2 quotes of Putin, of what Putin said at the beginning, with Russia didn't start this war, but its operational goal was to end it, therefore glossing over the complexities and consequences of his war. And another telling how this war is a matter of life and death and a matter of historical importance for the Russian nation. So we've got here, just in 2 quotes in the special military operation part, emotional appeal, loaded language, binary opposition, hyperbole, and fear appeal, all used in that single quote to influence the reader's opinions and align them with the authors, creating a sense of urgency that discourages critical analysts. Very important to also discuss how this textbook is going to be used, if it will be used, on occupied territories. Again, Armin Gasparin, he was one of the authors for the 10th grade new edition textbook. He's telling how once Russia occupied and annexed Crimea, it was relatively easy for them to start promoting and teaching the Russian curriculum. After a week, he said, so-called needs verifying. As for Zaporizhia and Kherson, he also notes of the difficulty and says that the Russian government will have to put special emphasis on teaching teachers, teaching how to manipulate in their discourse of what actually happened. This is very, very interesting because it shows that and underscores the deliberate and systematic approach to shaping historical consciousness and demonstrates the extent of effort invested in perpetuating the Decide ideology. So they understand the resistance that the people will give in these occupied territories. A very interesting and important part of it's kind of a collaboration of all things. It's not just the textbook, but it's also the curriculum and the systematic way of teaching in Russia, which makes this textbook so influential and important for the Russian state propaganda. The emphasis on reproducing information in the Russian system, rather than critically analyzing, has hampered the development of independent analysis and thought. The centralized curriculum, and which is tightly controlled by the Russian government, further restricts the exploration of diverse perspectives and prevents open discussions. While this was especially prevalent during the times of the Soviet Union, it still affects a sizable portion of today. Now, one more component which we have seen quite recently, which goes hand in hand with the lack of critical thinking, with the updated, distorted textbooks, is also the new course which will be coming into schools, and that's the initial military training to take over what was once, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, the life safety basic class. So a subject which, I'm told of life safety basic skills, will now be used to talk about initial military training. This, quite recently, only last week, the host of Volodymyr Solovian, Russian television propagandist and host, was seen shouting in a rage due to the Russian elites' pushback of this new course, not wanting to let their children take part, obviously, in such a young age, initial military training. It's to learn not only about what happened in the war, but also special people from the so-called special military operation will be teaching the course, and it will they will be taught everything they need to know in terms of energy as well and safety. So it's a really strange course, but all of this together creates a instrument of manipulation and indoctrination of the younger generation of the Russian population. So what I want you to take from today in my part of the conversation is basically the textbooks, manipulations and indoctrination are designed to shape the perceptions of an emerging generation, portraying Russia as both a victim and a victorious force, single-handedly fighting and combating the collective West. This narrative is reinforced by an educational system that not only fails to foster critical thinking, but actively suppresses it. Additionally, the curriculum's shift from life safety basics to this new initial military training adds yet another layer to this instrument of propaganda manipulation. So this altogether serves the current regime's objective, indoctrination, stability, and the justification of Russia's war on Ukraine. So one more quote which I just want to leave you with, again from George Orwell, is who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past.
Дуже дякую, Мете, за такий глибокий аналіз позиції інформаційної.
Thank you, Matt, for these very fundamental analysis of these textbooks. And I would like to ask Ms. Alina, the professional historian, and what is your opinion on these textbooks? What narratives did you see there? So, well, first of all, the book is always analyzed by the cover. And if we can show the cover of this textbook, in this case, we can see that how it is represented, how this book is represented. And the interesting thing about it is at the beginning of the history for the 11th grade, they start not from the 20th century, as it is done in Ukraine, and Ukrainian textbooks, and also the European textbooks. So for the 11th grade, we start to study more detailed history of the 20th century, but since 1945, and that is quite, it tells us a lot, because if we analyze the text of this book without even discussing the authors of these books and those who are representing this book, in this case, we can see that we have the person, Sergei Pavlovich Karpov, the honorable member of the Academy of Science of the Russian Federation, and his professional topic, and he teaches in the Moscow State University. He is teaching Byzantine studies, and the person who is not professional on this topic, he did the review of these topics. And if we take, for example, as example, Medinsky is a propagandist of the Russian Federation, who is a founder of the ideology of fascism. And we can see that as a red line through all these books, and we can see this ideology of fascism in every text. And once again, I would like to repeat that Timothy Snyder, they have defined this ideology, and they have shown on their own, in their own researches, that this ideology is very similar with the totalitarian ideologies such as Nazism. And we can put theoretical and practical equal sign here, and Medinsky is a founder of this ideological system, and therefore his surname, his last name, is in the first line of the authors. But if we move forward, and if we consider this book from the historical point of view, then we can find there fakes, propaganda, unjustified materials which do not have any kind of historical justification or background, and as my colleagues have already mentioned, that is an oral system, the system which you can obviously see in this book, in this textbook. And why it is so it is such a threat for Ukraine. The thing is that at the moment, the new generation is raised in the Russian Federation. The generation which is brought in this atmosphere, in the atmosphere of the general militarization, because through all this book we can see the call. We can see that the Russians were always fighting for their territories. They were always fighting for their territories, and their territories are the Baltic countries, that are the countries which, the Middle East countries, so the former Soviet Union countries, and they are trying to represent them as the original Russian lands, and that is the chauvinism of the Russian Federation. That is their chauvinist system and universe, and therefore we can see how clearly they show. They do not divide the history of the Russian Federation, which, by the way, they were dividing from the general European context before. But nowadays, if we take the Russian Federation now and replace it with the Soviet Union, you won't notice a difference, because in this textbook they are showing that the Russian Federation, the modern Russian Federation, has inherited the Soviet Union rights. But the most important thing is that this textbook is based on the Putin's speeches, and it seems that all these speeches of Vladimir Putin were collected and combined in one textbook. So it seems like it was just his press officer who was taking down notes during his speeches and created a textbook. But the most important thing is that this propagandist thought is becoming a kind of constanta, which you are not able to contradict. Because for the person who works in the field of history, because history is the thing which creates the understanding of is creating the understanding of your own state. These scientists, they are showing that the entire world is an enemy, and Ukraine, a big chapter is dedicated to Ukraine. And what is more important, since 1970s, they are. I'm not even talking about the Second World War, about the end of the Second World War, where they are saying that after 1945, the Russian Federation won this war, and that were the Russians who got this victory, the only ones. They are not talking of the allies in this war. They are not talking of the way how the Europe was rebuilding after the Second World War. They are not talking about the Cold War and why the Cold War is happening. They are just contradicting any contribution of the democratic societies in the fight against Nazism in a very brutal way. And in this way, they put an equal sign between them as they are now with aggressors, because in the framework of so-called special military operation, this is a separate chapter for them, because they want to create one correct thought about the events which are happening now on the territory of Ukraine. Therefore, I would like to recap everything. So what is important for us, as for Ukrainians, for our allies? It is important for us that the new generation of the Russian Federation would not be educated in this enemy system of values, because the history for the Russians became a new religion, and it is actually a religion because they have a cult of victory, the cult of heroes. and it became the religious category, the category which cannot be discussed and should be accepted. And as we know, according to the legislation of the Russian Federation, any kind of criticizing of Stalin is means some legal consequences. And even in this textbook, we can see that Stalin was doing the right things. He was not a dictator. And the collective did not understand that, and all these famines that it was just nothing, and all this book is justifying why he was doing that. Why this textbook is so important? Because a new generation is raised up in the enemy's system of values. The enemy one towards Ukrainians, towards Ukraine, where we are facing the war. And the war is actually called the Special Military Operation. And since the 24th of February 2022, as my colleagues have already mentioned, they are justifying the occupation of the Crimean Republic, and they are trying to show that Ukraine is a failed state, that Ukraine is a fake country, and just because the Soviet Union collapsed, these kind of countries like Ukraine were able to appear. And Ukraine, during the last 30 years, as they say, they had ultra-Nazistic values. What do they mean by that, by these ultra-Nazist values? They mean that in Ukrainian schools, we have Ukrainian language and the Russian schools are closed, but it's also fake because in Kiev and all around Ukraine, we had before the full-scale war, we had schools where education was in Russian language, and we also had Russian language as a foreign language in schools, and that is one of the things one of the parts of their propaganda, and that is just one piece of the information we are just talking about now. And the amount of propaganda which contains in this textbook, we can compare this amount only to the one we faced in the Soviet Union, because the basis of the Soviet propaganda was taken and implemented in this textbook, but with different narratives, with the modern Russian Federation. And with the head of their state, who likes playing history, but history is not a game. History is studied by the people and the children who are interested in history, and the generations. They have to use the reliable sources, and they should not use propaganda sources. And this textbook is a propaganda textbook. And as we have already mentioned, that is a threat. The threat, first of all, for Ukraine and for the entire Western world, because these young people, after reading these propaganda textbooks, they will grow up with another values in their lives, and they would be ready. And as it was mentioned in the textbook, they would be ready to protect the Russians in Berlin, in the other countries of Europe and the entire world. And it is a clear task which is written in this textbook. The USA, the United Kingdom, and all so-called Anglo-Saxon world is the key threat for the Russian Federation. And the Russian Federation was always a peaceful country with its, and I would like to underline that, with its nationals, Tatars. I do not know why, but they put them on the second place. It is because Tatars are one of the nations which populate the most territory, and on the third place they have Ukrainians, because Ukraine and Ukrainians they are always on their mind, and in this way they are trying to justify this war. One of the biggest wars in Central Europe, which is unfolding known after the Second World War. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Ms. Alina, for your very deep justification and justified analysis. And unfortunately, we do not have that much time, but maybe in the framework of these, as a conclusion, I would like to raise another question, that is situation with the history on the occupied territories. If we modulate the situation where Ukraine gets back the territories which were occupied, some of them are around more than 9 years under occupation. It means that the children who went to school to the first grade when the occupation started, they are in the high school now, and they are going to, since September, they are going to use these new textbooks for the 10th, 11th grade, where Ukraine is represented from the perspective of the Russian propaganda. In this case, I would like to ask you, what do you think about it, and what do you think we could modify, and what we could change? Do you think we need to do something right now, or first we have to deoccupy these territories, and then we can work on the policies of the ideological policies and the rest? Maybe is the program which we have now quite adaptive and can be used on the territories which were lost around 9 years ago? Thank you very much for a good question. Analyzing these textbook, we can say that one of the reasons for their for this war is one of the reasons was decommunization, and that was a kind of a fan for them, as far as I understand. But nevertheless, we are not interested in their opinion. We have to work on our own policy, and we also have to work on our historical policy, the policy of memory. In my opinion, so far we have to understand that the territory of Ukraine, that Ukraine is going to be the integral country, and those ones who were taught in LNR and DNR and occupied Crimea, we should not lose these people, even though it sounds very sad, but these people were brought up in Russian propaganda, and the most important thing for us is to build the plans for the future. We have to start speaking about that, and I think that we have brilliant history textbooks authors, and our Ministry of Education and Culture works really well, and the Institute of the National Memory, and altogether we have to start thinking, we have to start creating the commission, because tomorrow will be late, and tomorrow we have to make the list of the textbooks, and we have to start working with the teachers, because the children who are observing this propaganda, they are observing this propaganda from their tutors, from their teachers, and we have to start thinking on how we have to work with these teachers, and after that we have to think how these new textbooks should look like, and how we are going to implement them, how we are going to integrate them in this new society, because these people were brought up on the enemy propaganda. The example is really good, that is Germany. After 1989, and the generation which was brought up in this social ideology, it was also soaked with Russian propaganda, but the western part of Germany was able to integrate this society, to integrate them in the Western style of lifestyle and policy, because for some of the people who truly believe in these propaganda, that will be a huge tragedy, because the entire world they imagined is going to be destroyed, and that is horrible. That is horrible, especially for the children. For the children whose psychological state is not that stable, and therefore step by step we have to work on the first level. We have to work with the teachers, and I think that there would be lots of cases when we will find that they are the infiltrators and collaborators, and I think that our national policy have to regulate it, because we do understand that there is a very good Soviet joke that the government changes and the hat is changing. We should not have the situation when the 100% collaborators are just changing the government changed and they start teaching Ukrainian children. We have to be ready for different scenarios, and we have to start thinking on that now, because in the future we have to have the state, the strong state. And in this textbook, by the way, in this textbook, it is mentioned that there was a segregation in segregation in Ukraine, segregation according to the language. It is also a big fake, because in Ukraine we have never had the language segregation. And I think that people who live in Ukraine, they would say that even nowadays there is nobody forbids you to speak Russian. Maybe that is one of the reasons for the Russian aggression, because they are trying to protect those who are speaking Russian, because they are coming to the places where the Russian centers, cultural centers exist. Unfortunately, I face a situation when we have a lot of these kind of centers all around Europe, and that is also a threat for the Western democracy, because it's not a secret that Putin can come to Dresden, his favorite Dresden, and he can say, "Oh, we have the Russian Cultural Center. There are 8 people speaking Russian, and I want to protect them." Of course, I'm joking, but there is still a threat, and this threat is a big threat. So therefore, the segregation, there has never been the language segregation in Ukraine, but all of these things were made to make. First of all, Russians afraid of Ukrainians, and second of all, to make the Ukrainians be afraid of Ukrainians. What is the alternative? The alternative is Ukrainian online school. And even on the occupied territories, I do understand that it's so dangerous when we have war ongoing, but just recently I saw the story of the boy from Kherson who was studying in Oleshka school he was studying propaganda school, and he was going to the cemetery to find the internet and to listen to Ukrainian school, and it is quite dangerous. And I do understand that not everyone can afford this pleasure, but he said that he was leaving his phone on the cemetery, and he was using the other one at school, because if someone would have ever found this phone, of course he would have faced repressions, and of course repressions are also used against Ukrainians and even children, and there are special torture places where, and actually in Kherson, some of them were found after the occupation, where the parents and children were in the same places, in the chambers, and the parents heard what was happening to their children. And it shows once again that the history is the weapon which is used commonly by the Russians, and we have to have the weapon as well. And we as Ukraine and our partners, Western partners, have to have this weapon as well. Thank you very much, Miss Alina. And actually, thank you because we are ending with a very inspiring story of this boy from Oleshki, and we hope that our resilience will help us to overcome all the challenges in the infosphere, and we will be able to come back to. We will bring back our co-citizens, especially the young generation which was brought up in the narratives Ukraine where Ukraine was considered to be the enemy. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is over. Of course, this topic is very big one and very important one, and we can continue it. And I hope that in the next our meetings we will be able to cover this topic and we can see different angles of these topics. So stay with us. Thank you very much.